Boy, oh boy, am I excited to be covering this. It's King of Bots! Like, we've talked a lot about the likes of Robot Wars and BattleBots. You know, those are two of the biggest combat shows in the entire world. Robot Wars being one of the biggest ones over in the UK, BattleBots being the biggest over in the US, and then you've got King of Bots, which was a more recent offering from China that got a lot of people in the community talking at the time. I remember when this was being unveiled, like, this was a pretty big deal. And as we go through it, I think you'll begin to see why. Some of the teams that got involved, some of the robots are quite recognizable. Let's not waste too much time, let's just get straight into the episode. Now, King of Bots starts off with this CGI intro, which looks like it would make for a baller video game intro, and I actually find it kind of endearing. Like, I don't really think you would see that with the other shows, like BattleBots or Robot Wars. We then meet Jet Li, who brings up how there are veterans and newcomers alike, and he really is not kidding, as it has been a while since I last watched this, so I got to be surprised once again by some of the names and faces that appear. They also show the King of Bots trophy, which honestly looks great, and just in general, King of Bots has put a lot in looking as good as its contemporaries in Robot Wars and BattleBots. We then meet the commentators Huang Jiangshang and David Wu, who explain the BattleBots-inspired arena as well as the various hazards throughout. This might be controversial, but I think I might like the spike drums more than the screws. I'm unsure, but they just look cool, in my opinion, so yeah, I quite like them, honestly. They of course go over the rules, but there isn't anything crazy to note. They seem to be keeping things relatively safe and aren't straying too far away from the rule set and judging criteria that we're used to in other competitions. They then introduce the judges, and of note for us is Ian Lewis, well known for being part of the team that created Robot Wars and BattleBots Legends, Razor, and Warhead. We then go to Luo Shi, who, as it's the first episode, generally spends longer setting things up. There isn't a whole lot for us to mention here, as they just generally talk about how new this is all for them, but thankfully after nearly 5 minutes, we finally get word of our first match for the episode. And that first match is Stingray versus Megabyte. This one is an international special on both fronts. First up, we've got Team Weber competing with a drum spinner that they've named Stingray. I remember Team Weber getting some notability in the Russian scene back in the day with their titular robot Weber, to the point where it actually fought in an episode of Robot Wars. This robot has a drum that reminds me of robots like Pain Train the way that it's built. Their opponents, though, are no slouch by any means. It's Megabyte from America! Megabyte, for those who don't know, is actually the predecessor to the BattleBots robot you're more familiar with in Gigabyte. And Megabyte's actually been competing in combat robotics since around about 2004, I think. I could be mistaken on the exact time, but the point is, it's been like over 10 years that Megabyte's been competing. It's kind of impressive, really, and it's been a fairly dangerous robot in its time. Now, before we actually get into the fight itself, I also want to point out one other difference that this arena has over the BattleBox. Instead of the buttons that we're used to, they actually go with levers. I actually think it's a cool touch for their aesthetic, though the cool factor does get taken away slightly when it does that sound, that blah. Now the fight begins as both robots get up to speed, with Stingray chasing after Megabyte with a huge shot sending both robots flying. Megabyte is crashing all over the walls, meanwhile Stingray loses one half of their drive. By the way, when Megabyte is bouncing around, they actually end up ripping one of the spikes off of the wall. That's incredible amounts of power. The second shot is just as brutal, if not more so, ripping Stingray's drum clean off. The third shot rips further chunks off of the robot, and Stingray is counted out in a brutal display from Megabyte. They really make the count out dramatic in this show. I felt like I was watching a drama where at some point Stingray would somehow keep on moving. Sadly for Stingray, that just was not going to happen, with Megabyte getting the win. What a great opening fight! Megabyte absolutely tore apart their opponent, which shows how good a shell spinner can be from them, and definitely had me wondering back when I first watched this when it was new, how far they would go. It really shows you like the countless amount of hours that they've put into making Megabyte as efficient as it possibly can be. Next up, we have Vulcan versus Excalibur. Now in this we have the Apollo team coming in with an axe robot called Vulcan. Vulcan is clearly inspired by that John Reed style of axe and hammer robot such as Terahertz and Beta, but I do feel it has its own sense of style with the pipes around the robot and apparently having a first person camera to help with accuracy. Excalibur meanwhile, funnily enough, looks a little Apollo inspired in the flipper design. I actually really like what they've done here. So the robot is your typical big wedge flipper that you might see in the UK, but with two wedgelets at the front, it does feel like Excalibur has been designed thoughtfully to deal with getting under opponents. They also mentioned the builder being into ACG, and I wasn't sure what that meant, so I looked it up, and it turns out that it means that they're into animation, comics, and games. Just to help anyone who didn't understand like myself, that seems to be like a term for the community over in China. So, if you ever feel bad about being called a weeb, just say, no way man, I'm in the ACG community. The robot and the preview videos they do for each team honestly made it look really impressive. It had me excited for this match. And then their constant references to their waifu honestly had me thinking, God, we really should have them fight like Overhaul, shouldn't we? I did look into it because they kept mentioning about the inspirations, but I couldn't quite tell what they were saying. And it turns out that apparently the Excalibur on it is inspired from a visual novel series called Fate Stay Night by Type Moon. Apparently that game is on PS2? Who knew? Now before the match can begin, they mentioned some problems the Excalibur team were having before heading into this. It seemed to have to do with somewhere around the left wedgelet, which could be critical for ground clearance. Despite the tension the show builds up, thankfully Excalibur is able to make it, though from the way the show puts it, it was at the very last moment. And just before the fight, Vulcan shows off one more ability it has, the ability to raise its wedge up. I don't know. This seems like something purely for visual flair, which given the team also runs a live event, would make sense that they'd want to have their robot look entertaining, but competitively I am lost. Anyway, the fight itself begins with Vulcan racing over, but then they change trajectory, realizing Excalibur would easily wedge them. And when they clash, Excalibur does, flipping Vulcan over, who quickly recovers and begins swinging around blindly, flailing the axe all over the place like a madman. They do get a hit every so often, but most of the time they are flailing without purpose, and even end up flipping on the floor flipper. Excalibur, speaking of, keeps on them, flipping them over a number of times, and eventually they cause a wheel to pop right off of Vulcan. Excalibur then flips them near a pulverizer, while Vulcan is now struggling to self-right, not having the energy bind behind the weapon anymore, and soon the point of the axe gets stuck in a hole for one of the hazards, meaning that they're not able to self-right anymore. With that, they are counted out, giving the win to Excalibur. Honestly, given Excalibur is a new robot against a veteran team, they did very well for themselves here. The flipper isn't especially powerful, but I feel in an arena like the Battle Box, the flipper power isn't the most important thing, as long as you can maintain control, which they did very well. Especially as I felt Vulcan had a lot harder time remaining controlled itself. I do think Vulcan is cool, but it definitely needed some refining. Excalibur, meanwhile, had an exceptional performance. That was brilliant work. Next up was Nucleus versus Gluttonous Snake. This one is an interesting combination of control robots. On one side we have Nucleus, a horizontal grabber which is exceedingly rare a robot to see. A few notable examples from memory being Tough as Nails, Big Nipper, and Can Opener. It looks fairly solid, but the claws themselves do look rather small, which normally these types of robots want really large claws so that they can wrap around any robot, even the wider ones. Their opponent was Gluttonous Snake. Okay, I'll be real for a second here. It's actually really difficult for me to know the exact names for sure, because the wiki and the Mech Plus translation are sometimes giving different names for the robots. I think it's something to do with like the way that the names are translated, so there's no concrete answer. So, if I'm getting some names wrong, please go easy on me. I'm just going with what I'm given here. Anyway, Gluttonous Snake is a grabber and lifter robot, the actual design of which gives me vibes of Complete Control, as it's in that similar vein of robots like it and Claw Viper. I have to say, the robot actually looks really impressive. The main weapon is a little thin looking, but still, I love the look of this thing. Now the fight starts off hesitantly with Nucleus barely moving. Apparently the magnets used to improve the traction, which a lot of robots like to use, cause Nucleus to actually get stuck. Glutton the Snake tries to get them moving, and twice they try to lift the robot, but with a poor grip and some overly strong magnets, they just can't quite manage it. Thankfully, we are soon met with back-to-back suplexes once they get a better hold on. The battle goes to the judges, who give it to Glutton the Snake, and while it wasn't the best match ever, Glutton the Snake, once they did figure things out, seemed to really take to the robot. Meanwhile, Nucleus sadly just never really got themselves going properly. It was a weak match overall, but I wouldn't be too harsh given that these are two newer teams. You know, you kind of have to expect that with newer teams, it's not always going to be some crazy home run performance. After that, we got Catapulting Shield versus Poor Dinosaur. Catapulting Shield is a cluster bot in this one. It's honestly a pretty cool idea in my opinion, with a smaller wedge robot to get under opponents, and then a flipper that looks like somewhere between robots like Beast and Weber in its design. I can see why they went with this route with their robot. It's honestly not a bad looking design. Poor Dinosaur though is the real MVP here. If there was ever a Hall of Fame for joke robots, I feel like this would have to be in the very first induction class. I mean, just look at it! They even laugh as it comes down to the arena. The robot has this axe, but let's be real, none of us are looking at that. The fight starts, and the long, narrow shape of Poor Dinosaur's design is making movement very difficult for the dino, as the clusterbot just seems to be figuring out what they could even do with it. The size difference is immense, look at this! It's like those fights that Chinchilla had back in the day. The Wedgebot does manage to get under Poor, but not to much effect, though soon one of Poor's wheels comes off. Soon the flipper decides to get involved, and it starts firing, and while they initially miss their flips, they soon rip the dinosaur clean off of the robot, and it doesn't take too much longer before they flip the main robot over, where it is counted out, meaning Catapulting Shield moves on. After that we got War Tiger versus Wild Beasts. War Tiger is a disc spinner looking robot. It might be more of a drum, I'm not entirely sure, but it does look pretty nice in my opinion, especially with that massive impractical tiger head on top. It actually does have like a bit of visual flair to it. Wild Beasts, meanwhile, is this disc spinner, giving me vibes of somewhere between Witch Doctor and Reality. The show calls it a cluster because it has a drone and this little wedge robot. In fact, I think it typically calls any robot with a drone a cluster bot, which I don't know how I feel about that. Just because drones are such an insignificant part of the total package, that I never know how I feel. I don't really know how I feel about a robot with a drone being called a cluster, but that's just me. Anyway, the fight starts, and in this one, the drone goes over first to get involved, though, of course, it's immediately killed by War Tiger. Soon the robots clash weapon to weapon, and War Tiger has 2/3 of its spinner ripped clean off. What in the world just happened? Then one of its drive chains is ripped off, and as it's running away from the immense damage, it runs onto the floor flipper, tipping it onto that big old head where it's unable to move and is counted out. It's not a crazy fight, but it's a great first showing for the Wild Beasts. And unfortunately for War Tiger, it looks like it was just a pretty face in this encounter. After that, we got the fight that I've been really excited to see. Spectre versus Red from the Flames. Now, if you've seen my BattleBots reviews, you know I love Quantum. It's easily one of my favourite BattleBots and has to be one of the best crushers of all time. And this is where it all began, with Spectre in King of Bots. Red from the Flames, meanwhile, is a piston spike robot, which is even rarer than a horizontal grabber like we saw earlier. I think this is actually why I have fond memories of this show. We have weapon variety we don't typically get to see anymore, as this is still the earlier stages of Chinese heavyweight combat. Saying that, I knew this was not going to be a pretty fight for them. The fight begins and immediately Spectre wedges them. They back away though, and get around the side and get a mean bite in, piercing through the armour like it's butter. Then it does the same on the back end, then onto the other side. They then hold Red from the Flames over the fire, and Red from the Flames lets loose a flamethrower I didn't even know about as Spectre runs around them, soon pushing them into the wall. They save the best for last though. Just when it already looked over for Red from the Flames, Spectre gets one last bite in, piercing the flamethrower, causing the robot to explode. With that, the robot is, as they say after the fight, essentially beyond repair as it's counted out. It was a crazy dominant fight from Spectre, and I remember this fight fondly, as it's the fight that made me hooked on this robot and such a big fan of them, and it was why I was so cautiously excited when Quantum was announced to be making its debut in BattleBots. This was a one-sided fight, but it might be one of my favourites. After that, we got Wind Shredder versus Seawolf, and it's Carbide at home versus Hydra at home. Okay, that maybe isn't very fair. There's only so many ways to do a horizontal spinner, and it again looks decently solid. Seawolf, meanwhile, I'm less confident in, as it does look notably bulkier and less armoured, which against the spinner is not a good thing to be. The notable thing they do point out with the team is the age of the members, with the captain being over 70 years old. Seawolf also isn't a flipper despite my earlier comparison, it's actually a lifter. Given its size, that always tends to surprise me, as I always forget that detail when looking at it. I mean, when you see something that bulky, you usually expect to see some CO2 in it, you know, some gas or something to allow the flipper to puncture, but no, it's a lifter. Anyway, the fight begins and Seawolf comes spinning and drifting around while Wind Shredder is only making light attacks. With Seawolf's lifter in the air and Wind Shredder's spinner constantly stopping, it definitely isn't the most awe-inspiring fight. Though soon they do manage to tear chunks out of Seawolf, which dies in what was honestly a bit of a sad display. And this was probably the weakest fight of the night. Neither robot really puts out a stellar performance in the arena, so I can't get too excited about Wind Shredder's win. On a nice note, they do mention in a bit of a sentimental moment that building robots is not easy, and how the Seawolf team undoubtedly spent a lot of time on the robot, even if it didn't work out. And that's something I always try to keep in mind with these robots, and why I try not to lay into a robot or team themselves too much, as at the end of the day, the fact that any of these teams have built a robot and got it into the arena, especially in this weight class, is a testament to their skills. That's way more than most of us could do, quite frankly. Like, yeah, this fight was not very good, like, I'm not going to try and say otherwise, but the fact that they were there at all, and, you know, it was honestly way more than I think a lot of us could really reasonably expect of ourselves, and it definitely would have taken a lot of time and effort to get to this point. My biggest gripe, though, would be that this was the main event of the episode. Given how incredible some of the fights were throughout the episode, I'm shocked that they picked this one to be the fight to end off the episode, as it kind of took me by surprise. Overall, though, I'm not going to let that take away from the episode all too much, as this episode has so many good fights in it and so many good moments. I think it's a must-watch for any of you. But is it as big and powerful as BattleBots, or as good as the likes of, say, Robot Wars Series 10? I don't think so. But I gotta say, like, if we're talking about, like, a really quite good series of robot combat, memory serves correct, King of Bots is going to be one of those, and I'm looking forward to watching and reviewing the rest of the episodes. Robots like Spectre and Megabyte had some awe-inspiring performances. Robots like Excalibur and Gluttonous Snake, in my opinion, were just great new robots that show a great deal of potential. And robots like Poor Dinosaur are just perfection personified. Overall, I'd say this is a pretty entertaining episode of Robot Combat. If you're able to access Mech Plus, which is generally free, though if you want to get rid of the ads, it's like £20 a year, you could watch King of Bots right now with subtitles. It's definitely a recommendation from me because overall, I think it's pretty fun. And for the first big, like, televised Chinese robot combat competition, it's pretty dang good. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell to be notified of future videos on the channel. Comment down below what you thought of this episode if you haven't already. And if you can share this video around, that'd be super appreciated. It gets more eyes on the channel and really does help me out. We also have memberships where you can get access to exclusive videos. Right now, I'm trying to work on getting videos out every day during December, but I do promise you there are more members exclusive videos coming on their way. But with that all being said, I hope to see you all next time. Bye, guys!